I read someone who said that the weight of the entire white population of the U.S. was with Derrick Chauvin when he killed George Floyd in Minneapolis. I'm not going to repeat that person's name because they are garbage. But now we're hearing about systemic racism and institutional racism, all about entire, a business, a government, a school, or whatever, set up to hold the black man down. And so I want to look at that. Let's just try to find evidence. And I think a good place to start would be the Minneapolis Police Dept. That's the scene of the crime. And by the way, I Googled systemic racism, and some experts came up with thoughts. One was John Oliver. He's that guy from England, went to school in England, graduated with an English degree from college in England, became a successful comedian here in the States, and now he has his own late-night TV show. Obviously an expert. He says, yes, there is systemic racism in America. Also, Ben & Jerry's ice cream guys. Absolutely, systemic racism exists. Now, that's the quote from the experts. Let me tell you my opinion. When I look at the Minneapolis Police Department, the first thing I want to share with you is a quote from the chief of police talking about this. He said this, don't let, and I quote, I wrote this down, don't let Chauvin's action reflect the values of the Minneapolis Police Department. They don't. In other words, there is no systematic racism here. I looked back into his history, which is pretty unique. He's been a cop in Minneapolis since 1989, over 30 years. In 2012, he was the director of Internal Affairs Unit. This is the group that investigates bad cops. For brutality, racism, or whatever. And then he became the chief of police in 2017. And oh, by the way, he's African American. I also looked in the history of some of the Minneapolis police stuff. Several years ago, they did a study and found out that the police made an average of 147 traffic stops a day. Problem was, 40% of those were African Americans in the cars. And they felt that was bad because the population was only 18% African American. And so they set aside to work on that, change some things, redo some training, whatever. They also found that only 10% of the police force were African American, and yet 18% of the population. So they took the initiative to go into African American communities to speak to, churches, community centers, schools, and encourage more African Americans to become cops. Does that sound like systemic racism to you? I think not. I just want to remind you of this. We had this thing called slavery, and it was awful. But we had 700,000 people die to end it. And then, of course, we had Jim Crow laws, and those were laws established by cities and states for the sole purpose of keeping the black man down. That's where businesses would have a sign up that says whites only, and that kind of stuff. But thank goodness in 1955, Rosa Parks, African-American woman, climbed on a bus and refused to go sit with the coloreds. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. My point is, we've made so much progress decade after decade. There is no systemic racism in this country. It's all individual, and we will continue to progress further even with that.